what is the latest on the battlefield with Ukraine's offensive? Right before the Prigozhin chaos, I mean, Russia seemed to be in the driver's seat. And as you said, the Western mainstream media has been talking a lot about the surprise of Russia's strength in its defenses. So where are things at? Where are they going with this offensive?
Again, it's important to remind people that Russia has layered defenses. They're layered specifically so that Russia can give ground to Ukrainian attacks as they intensify, as Russia's mobile defense rate in the security zone, as that diminishes, they're able to pull back to these defensive lines and continue to absorb Ukraine's offensive potential. All of these trained men and all of their equipment. So where they are right now is they're still working through the security zone. They're not even up to the main defense lines. There's multiple defense lines from where Ukraine is trying to reach now all the way to Crimea, and in the Donbas region from Bakhmut all the way to Popasnaya. And we've talked about this, Danny, you and me, many times. We've talked about how Russia, maybe they'll give up a whole bunch of territory to Ukraine. It doesn't matter, because once the offensive is over, no matter where it ends on the map, Ukraine does not have the ability to sustain anything beyond that. They have no ability to hold the territory that they take. And NATO now, this round, they don't have another army to give Ukraine. So they are really reaching the ultimate limit of what they're able to do in this proxy war without NATO intervening themselves directly. And even that is compromised by the fact that they've depleted their stockpiles, their land forces, transferring it all over to Ukraine for the last year plus now.
And supposedly there's a war with China to prepare for. But before we talk about something like that, Alexei Reznikov, Ukraine's defense minister, he seems to not agree with you, Brian. He said, he claimed when asked by the media, he said, this was the Financial Times, he said that right now Ukraine's offensive is not the main event and just a preview. And when the major push happens, you will all see it. Everyone will see everything. So again, there seems to be this confidence, and I'm wondering, is there a reason to be confident? Is this real? Is this like selling wolf tickets here? Like what's going on? Because, and this has been a pattern with Ukraine's leadership. Zelensky and among others have throughout this conflict, when things are not going so well, they kind of put on this face that they have something else in store. But arguably, we haven't seen serious Ukrainian advances for 10 months now?
Absolutely. Well, in a way, he's right. There still is quite a bit of offensive potential left in this specific force that Ukraine created for this particular offensive. So he's not entirely wrong about that, but he's acting as if, well, we have all of these brigades with Western tanks that we haven't used. It doesn't really seem that way. It seems like they have been using that equipment and they've been losing that equipment. But as I said, they're trying to get through the security zone. And I think eventually they will get through the security zone. If they don't get through the security zone, then they're actually much weaker than I think anyone anticipated. I think even Russia expects them to get through the security zone and at least several layers of the defenses. And again, in Bakhmut, no sooner did Russia secure Bakhmut, the offensive began. So did they have time? And I've talked about this. Did they have time to properly secure Bakhmut against a major offensive? If Ukraine is staging part of that offensive force there for Bakhmut specifically, that would be a huge PR victory for Ukraine. But again, in terms of the actual conflict, they're squandering their forces that they're not going to be able to replace. They could potentially take Bakhmut back. People should be prepared for that. They should be prepared for a breakthrough in the south. The point is, east of Bakhmut are kilometers and kilometers of layered Russian defenses that they have prepared for over half a year, which is entirely unlike the front that Ukraine is pushing along right now in the Donbas region. So this is the problem. they might make some advances, and they might say, yes, that is the actual offensive, and they'll get away with it in the information space amongst Western audiences. You saw, I think everyone was seeing the reaction of the pro-NATO, pro-Ukrainian crowd regarding Prigozhin. They were talking about civil war, and you saw how detached from reality their reaction was, and it'll be just the same if Ukraine breaks through the security zone and actually makes it to any of these defense lines, or even passes some of these defense lines. So that's what he's talking about, and he's not entirely incorrect. But again, at the end of the day, what is he hoping to achieve? Does he actually think that this offensive is going to push Russian forces entirely out of what Ukraine claims is their territory? No, it's not going to. And even if it somehow did, they're not going to have an army left. Russia will.
The United States, during the whole Prigozhin chaos, was holding off on actually re-sanctioning, updating the sanctions on Wagner, almost with the belief that somehow Wagner itself had become some kind of useful instrument for them. But in any event, at the same time, we've seen NATO, the NATO Secretary General, Mr. Jens Stoltenberg, everyone's favorite punching bag. He came out and said that Russia should not be underestimated. But I always take these comments with a grain of salt, because on the one hand, you've heard NATO and the West, collective West, talk about, oh, well, Russia's capabilities are maybe are stronger than we think. But sometimes I think that that's really just a way. It might be true. I think it's true. But at the same time, it might be a way to just prolong the conflict and their role in it. Because usually it's coupled with, well, this is why we need to be more and more involved, because the only way Ukraine will win this conflict is on the battlefield. So your reaction?
Okay, that's kind of a 2-point question about the U.S. role in Prigozhin, the Wagner incident. On one hand, they said they weren't involved, which, I mean, when has the U.S. never been involved in something like this? And leading up to this is all the U.S. and Europe have talked about: disintegrating Russia, dividing and destroying Russia. They have entire papers published about this. And very recently, they've been talking about decolonizing Russia, which means balkanizing it, essentially. So this was their dream scenario. It's hard to believe that they had no role in this at all. They claim that they didn't want to get involved. They were worried. They were concerned. They were calling up Russia in the middle of it because they didn't want to see instability in Russia. They were worried about the nuclear arsenal falling into the wrong hands, something to this effect. But at the same time, they claimed that they had intel weeks ahead of time about this pending coup that Prigozhin was plotting, but they didn't tell Russia. So which is it? It doesn't, nothing they say adds up. The only thing we can be sure of is that the U.S. isn't telling us the truth. But what their role was in this, I've not seen evidence to prove one way or the other. So I think we should keep our minds open to that possibility, but I don't think we should draw any conclusions because we just don't know. Now you're talking about the collective West, the Western media, talking about how formidable Russia apparently is suddenly after, they didn't have shoes. They were freezing in their trenches.
Fighting with toilet seats or something like that, weren't they?
Yeah, and shovels.
Shovels, yeah.
Shovels. They took over Bakhmut using shovels. So now suddenly they're saying this. And it's interesting that you say that might be because NATO is trying to prepare the public for its intervention. We've actually seen articles where they're talking about the Ukrainian Air Force and how they're helpless right now with what they've been given from NATO, Soviet-era warplanes. And even if you transfer F-16s to them, they will still be helpless. The only way to help Ukraine in its offensive and onward is for NATO to intervene with its air power, use its air power to support Ukrainian troops. Kind of like what they did in Libya. They didn't go in on the ground, but NATO used its air force to change the tide, basically, for that conflict, and they ultimately destroyed Libya. So maybe they're thinking of something along the lines of that. regarding Ukraine. Think about it. If they're flying out of NATO territory, they're striking targets in Ukraine, they're going back to NATO territory, their bet is going to be that Russia wouldn't dare strike their airfields in NATO territory. They would try to avoid escalating. They're probably right about that, but I wouldn't want to be the person to make that decision. On the other hand, though, Russia does have air-to-air capabilities. They also have the best air defenses in the world. So NATO is not going to be doing this like they did in Libya, just bombing from 10,000 feet up, no consequences. They're going to lose warplanes. They're going to lose a lot of warplanes, just like Ukraine lost all of their warplanes. That is what's going to happen. So it's going to be a bloody nose for NATO, even if they do help level the playing field a little bit. And just remember, as you hinted at, we'll talk about the U.S. war they're trying to provoke with China. They're going to need that air power for China. That is how they're mainly going to be fighting China: air power, naval power.
Yep.
And they're going to have to make a decision. Do we commit this to Ukraine, or do we commit this to the Pacific? Because we really can't do both. I don't see how they can do both.
Yeah, and the scenario you described, I mean, do you feel like this is where it's going after this offensive? Because as you mentioned, once the offensive is over, no matter what happens, even if they break the defense lines, they end up meeting the Russian military, further east. There will be consequences in the sense that now NATO has to make a decision, because Russia will decimate the latest army, and there may not be much left to provide Ukraine to continue it by proxy. So do you feel like NATO will, I mean, to imagine a Libya scenario in Ukraine seems almost just unimaginable, because it means that they're kicking the ball in Russia's court and saying, what are you going to do? And obviously Russia's going to shoot down the planes. And then what will the U.S.? It seems like that could cascade into something incredibly dangerous globally in terms of a nuclear situation, because I don't think Russia will want to fight a direct war with NATO and lose all, that's not going to happen. And I don't think NATO would want that to happen either. So where would that go? If it gets, do you feel like it's getting to that point?
Well, I do. And I have been worried about this since the special military operation began in February 2022. I always said from the very beginning that the U.S., its allies, they will be tempted to, at a minimum, create some sort of buffer zone in Western Ukraine and expand hostilities from there, depending on what opportunities they think they can exploit by doing so. We've seen them do the exact same thing in Syria. That's what they are doing. They're still in Syria, but that was a losing proposition. And that was a scenario where you had Western warplanes in the sky, you had Russian warplanes in the sky, ground forces on the ground together. Sometimes there were incidents. I got very close to escalating or spiraling out of control, but there was the management of escalation, and it prevented, even though the U.S. was losing, they still realized that things really weren't in their favor. Russia really did dominate the means of escalating onward as the conflict devolved into a larger and larger fight. And I think the same scenario is probably going to play out in Ukraine. Think about it. Ukraine has been a part of Russia throughout history. This is practically a civil war in many ways. And Russia is right there on the border of what remains of Ukraine. And the United States is going to have to, they're going to be providing the bulk of the equipment, ammunition. If it gets to that, the fighters, the actual soldiers and airmen are going to be American. They're going to have to cross the Atlantic to get there, cross Europe to get to the battlefield, because none of the nations in Europe are going to be capable of fighting Russia, not by themselves, even collectively. We could even just look at the inventories of, say, France or the UK or Germany. What do they have left in their armies in terms of artillery or tanks? What type of air forces do they have? Do you think that their air force would be a bigger threat to Russia than Ukraine's? But I think Russia would be able to manage it. So it will be tempting for them, because I think it's the best chance that they have, and I think they are that desperate to explore that possibility.
Well, perhaps we can close our discussion about Ukraine on this note. I wanted to ask you about, so you may or may not have been following. There's been, during this offensive, there's been an interesting conversation among Russian academics, and the most, I think, highlighted has been Sergei Karaganov, and he has come out with a series of articles. There have been rebuttals. You can catch it on actually RT. But his initial article argued that Russia should preemptively strike Western Europe with nuclear weapons. And his argument his argument was, no, I am not for the use of nuclear weapons. I do not want to necessarily do so. But he was saying that practically, strategically, everything that this Ukraine conflict has taught us is that Western Europe itself are really the primary backers of this conflict. They are the ones providing most of the assistance, and the whole collective West, he argues, has gotten too comfortable. Like they truly don't understand the nuclear risk. So Russia should call the bluff and say, actually, there is one. And so he's went over some scenarios, maybe call off Russian nationals who may be living elsewhere, especially in Western Europe, call them back and say it's because there might be a preemptive nuclear strike, and that might, play at the rationality of Western leaders. But there has been a debate. Other Russian academics have said you might be trusting the collective West too much to be rational actors, and that might not be the best move. What is your take? What do you think about this idea? Because as you said, there have been hardline conversations, discussions happening, given the Prigozhin incident, given how long this conflict has gone. There obviously have been people who have been pretty hardline in Russia and outside of Russia saying, what is Russia waiting for? What's your opinion on this, especially with this nuclear question? Because we just mentioned that's a huge concern given the shape of this conflict and where it's already heading.
Again, the West is not acting rational. The West wouldn't be in the situation that they're in if they were acting rational. A rational circle of power, say in the US or Europe or combined, they would look at the world as it is right now. They would realize that it's changing and they would adapt to it. But what they're trying to do instead is fight against reality. They're fighting against a power, a force of change that is far larger than they are. They have no chance of resisting, and yet they're doing it anyway. This is not rational. The idea that they can contain and divide up and destroy and subjugate both Russia and China is madness. They're not thinking straight. They are not being rational. And when you listen to these people talk, and there is no secret smoky room around a table where they're all conspiring. They do this on YouTube, the Atlantic Council, Brookings Institution. They have their own YouTube channels, and they just openly talk about these things. And when you listen to them, you can hear how utterly detached from reality they are. This is a whole generation of politicians, military leaders, people involved in the economy that did not necessarily earn their positions where they are right now. They do not understand how reality actually works. They don't understand, evidently, they don't understand that if you want to wage a war against Russia and you want to continue this proxy war, you need to build factories that make the ammunition. You can't just say, we're just going to throw money at it and it'll fix it. You have to actually understand what happens with that money. How long does it take? How sustainable is this? How plausible is this? And they would realize that it isn't, and they would stop, but they're not stopping. So the whole, this is what Russia has been doing. This is what China is doing. They're trying to deter the West against their worst impulses, but it isn't seemingly working because they're not thinking rationally. The nuclear issue, Russia carrying out a first strike, that would be disastrous. And I really hope that does. I hope no nuclear weapons are used anywhere on anyone. that would be a complete disaster because everyone has enough nukes to wipe each other out. So nobody's going to win that. But there are other things Russia can do. There's other things China can do and are doing right now to create the conditions on the ground that just make this impossible. This is exactly what they did in Syria. They created the conditions on the ground that simply made the West's proxy war against Syria impossible. And it burned out, and now it's kind of frozen. But that's a lot better than Syria's fate hanging by a thread like it had been for several years. And I think they're doing the exact same thing right now regarding Ukraine. They're trying to create and demonstrate reasons why the West should not escalate further and the consequences for it. And I think they have a lot of ways of asymmetrically responding that will confound the U.S. and its allies if they decide to escalate further.
Oh, agreed. And I definitely want your thoughts on how I thought about this debate, and especially Karaginov's position. Is I understand having nuclear weapons and kind of reminding the collective. I get there might be a point where the collective West has to be reminded, look, this could end up in complete and utter disaster. However, given just what I've witnessed in recent history with U.S. leadership in particular, I do think it would be a grave miscalculation to believe that U.S. leadership, especially in foreign policy, are rational enough, believe in the self-preservation of their system enough to not do something incredibly rash if there was a preemptive strike by Russia. The United States, I don't think, can be trusted by any measure on what its response would be. And I think that's why it has been so smart for Russia to take the path that it has taken. Russia obviously has wanted to preserve its own military, its own forces, not, you've talked about it a lot, doesn't want a lot of casualties. It wants to protect people, honestly. It wants to protect its military. It wants to protect its forces. But at the same time, I also think there's another element. It also does not want a direct confrontation with NATO. I don't think it's necessarily scared of it, but I think Russia's pretty knowledgeable about what the consequences would be. And Russia would seemingly know best, given that NATO has formed a ring around it. So you don't really need much of a telescope to even understand, to see what is happening before its eyes. But what are your thoughts about that? That's my take. I don't want nuclear strikes either. I get if you need to remind, hey, this is the possibility. There could be very political moves you could take to remind, but at the same time, to actually conduct it would probably be a mistake, especially at this stage of the conflict, where Russia has seemingly done very well in this long war and is not on the verge of collapse. And there's no reason for desperation, it seems. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, I don't think, again, people talking about using nuclear weapons, I don't think they're zooming out and looking at the big picture entirely, because there's so many other things that Russia can and is doing right now. There's economic options. I'm pretty sure they're still sending gas through Ukraine, and even paying Ukraine for that gas is continuously flowing. They can shut off Europe completely, because they're not 100% off of Russian energy. And look at the consequences so far of them minimizing it as much as they can, or as much as they can bear. So there's those options, and there's military options. They have their forces. They've demonstrated they're not running out of missiles, and they can use these missiles anywhere. I think, if anything, there would be missile strikes beyond Ukraine's borders long before there would be any use of nuclear weapons. That would be way outside of what Russia has ever done, or the way Russia thinks, and the way Russia has been organizing its foreign policy. But maybe, the whole point is they're having the conversation to remind the West that they have nuclear weapons. Maybe that's the purpose of this. But again, if people are irrational, it doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't even matter if you do launch a nuclear weapon into Europe, they're still not going to get it. They're still going, look at the damage that has already been done to the West. Self-inflicted, and yet they continue. So I have no hopes of convincing them in that way. I think you will convince them when physically they're unable to continue their proxy war, just like in Syria.
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.